be honest with you, I've got a garage full of peat and coal. We've just had it delivered for Christmas. What the article was about was over in Ireland, they're going to be banning the production of peat because they see it as really a big contributor to CO2 emissions and climate change. And I didn't know that peat gave off far more CO2 than coal, and actually is very, very unhealthy. It doesn't give off a huge amount of heat. But thinking about it in terms of climate change, in terms of CO2 emissions, it was a question, should we actually start looking at what we're burning in our homes as well? We know that coal-fired generation is going out of business. They've stopped it all in the UK, but we're still doing it in our homes. And should we think again about whether that should continue?
Do you have any indication as to how much sort of coal or peat is imported to the island?
You know, that's a really good question. I haven't got a clue. Obviously, government will bring some in for the steam trains, and there will be a place like Cregnish which will need coal fires. I don't know how many people still have coal fires. I know certainly in Ramsey, when it's not too windy, but it's certainly cold, you can see the smoke coming out over the centre of town. Should we look again at what we're doing? Should we be using sustainable wood that can be grown on Ireland rather than importing stuff from across? Because the reality is, if peat's going to not be exported anymore from Ireland, we're going to have to think about what we're burning anyway.
And your argument was that we have wood produced on the island, and presumably that's a cleaner fuel people can use in their homes.
There's still a lot of controversy about that, and it was interesting some of the responses to my tweet, because some people were saying, well, wood's even worse. I think when you look at the UK, where they're importing wood chip from America to burn in power stations, that sounds a bit insane, really. In terms of the transportation costs. But what we have on the island is lots of offshoot wood. We've got lots of wood pulp from the sawmills. We've got the ability there to use that as an energy source rather than just throw it away, and that might be really useful. One of the other aspects to it, obviously, is fuel poverty, and some people who have to have a coal fire because they can't afford to heat their homes any other ways. We should be dealing with that, and I'd like to see the poverty commission that's sitting at the moment to actually look at fuel poverty in a lot more detail. And if we can both deal with fuel poverty and with environmental pollution at the same time, it's got to be a win-win for the island.
Is this a view that was expressed from sort of personal views or views as an MHK, or maybe as the chair of Max Utilities? Or
Very, very good question. I'll be honest with you, these are personal views. My wife is Irish, and so I know that starting a fire with peat and coal is really an ingrained tradition. But I think some of these older traditions need to be a bit challenged. There's also the aspect of safety. With my work with the Department of Home Affairs, I know that the number of fires in homes is going up, and some of that's electronic, some of that's faulty chargers, but some of that's open fires. We need to look again at how we heat our homes, and certainly in terms of climate change, we need to deal with CO2 emissions. We need to move from polluting coal, peat, and also oil towards more cleaner fuels such as gas and ultimately electricity to decarbonise the economy.
The reason I ask, it might have seemed like a slightly simplistic question, but obviously if we did ban, hypothetically, the importing of coal and peat, that would probably mean more income for Max Utilities as well.
Yeah, there is a vested interest in here, but if we're going to tackle climate change properly, we need to make small steps to decarbonise the economy. We need to get away from the past where we had polluting cars, where we have pollution in terms of heating homes. Those are the two biggest contributions to CO2. So small changes now would really pay off in the long term. And I think as people look at their own cars and try to get more economical cars, switch towards electric vehicles, so we should be looking at also at how we heat our homes and going towards cleaner options, which ultimately will be electricity.
The IPCC report recommended that we should be decarbonising our economies within the next decade. Is that a realistic time frame?
Within a decade, I think that would be a big economic shock to the island. But I know that DEFRA, the DOI, and Manx Utilities are working together. We're coming back to Tynwald in March with a strategy, both for feed-in tariffs for electric vehicles and space heating. We need to deal with this, and we need to do it in an adult and constructive way so that we don't price people out of the market. As I said, fuel poverty is a real issue, but we actually provide some decent alternatives to move towards electricity and then to move towards that electricity being produced by renewables in a sustainable way.
A separate article in The Guardian this month said that the sort of capacity for renewable energy has tripled in the UK in the past 5 years, and perhaps even that it's surpassed the capacity of energy from fossil fuels, which is quite a seismic change, really, in a short space of time. Are we at risk, perhaps, of falling behind the UK in that respect?
I think there's a degree of that. What the United Kingdom did was bring in huge incentives for people to start things like wind farms, solar panels. They're now starting to withdraw that. They were trying to get people to take up those new technologies. The Isle of Man is in a very good position. We've got a huge amount of really good, high-quality infrastructure here to produce energy from gas. But certainly between now and 2030, we need to look at how we're going to replace the gas-fired power station. And that's where things like the offshore wind farms, solar panels come in terms of large generation of power. But also what they're doing, certainly in the UK, is putting in far more interconnectors to bring power from places like Scotland with hydroelectric and wind power down to England. Whether we want to be part of that system as well is certainly one of the options.
Meanwhile, just outside of your jurisdiction in Ramsey, off Mackled Head, of course, there are plans to look for natural gas deposits there. Is that a process you would endorse above coal and peat, perhaps?
What the IPC report clearly said was that they saw natural gas as a transition from more polluting fossil fuels like coal into completely renewable supply. Whether we find gas off the coast of the Isle of Man is still up for grabs. The idea is to do seismic surveys, and then we will need a discussion about how that's either used or not used. So that's just purely exploratory work at the moment. But I think certainly that there is a future, short-term future for gas, so we can move away from more polluting fuels, but at the same time use any revenues that brings in to actually invest in renewables, because the future has to be a combination of probably wind, solar, and perhaps tidal or wave energy that supply the Isle of Man and give us, one, the power we need, but also the independence and that resilient system and that self-sufficiency that we also need.
You mentioned that the work at present is very much exploratory in nature, but hypothetically, were gas to be found, what kind of impact would that have on Manx utilities? Is that something that the organisation would want to work with?
Yeah, I mean, if natural gas is found and if it's then decided to bring it onto the island, Manx Utilities does have the infrastructure in terms of bringing gas onto the island. So theoretically, we could use that same infrastructure to export it, or use some of it locally to drive down prices for local people.
Just finally, one more. There was a new formation of a climate change coalition quite recently, and I believe you were in attendance at the launch. What kind of communication, if any, have you had with them, and what do you think of that as an idea?
When I was growing up as a kid, I was worried about climate change. That's continued, and as I've become a father, that's become even more astute. I think the Climate Change Coalition is a very good idea in terms of bringing together a whole range of people who have a shared concern for climate change, but also a shared vision of how to move towards a solution. We have the power to change things, and by working together, including with government, including with Manx Utilities, I think we could do something really special on the island. So I see it as a very positive move that people who have got a shared passion in making the Isle of Man a better place are actually talking together and meeting together now.